The new season split is here, and I've definitely got some updates to our weapon tier list compared to the one we had at the beginning of the season because, well, I'll admit, I think I got a little overzealous last time. But before we get into the tier list, and as always, just know we won't go over care package guns because they're obviously 3x S tier, and I think we all know how good they are, except for maybe the Rampage, but you know. And if you haven't already, make sure you head over to the GameLeap website for a huge 50% discount to get instant access to literally hundreds of videos, including guides, analytical breakdowns, VOD reviews, and so much more. Do not miss this chance and use code POG50, that's POG50, to get your 50% discount now. And of course, starting with the D tier, we've got the L-Star. While it did receive some very slight buffs a while ago, it's still very gimmicky, requiring you to really pay attention and pace your shots. As I said last time, it's got the same low DPS of only 140, and for reference, the alternator has a DPS of 160, and we all know that the alternator does feel a little low on that end as well. So all things considered, the L-Star is literally just an L. I feel like they need to maybe buff the damage just a smidgen. I don't know, maybe 150 DPS, but usually I'll say that buffing or nerfing damage is kind of just a band-aid in most cases, but this is one of those cases where the damage is so low that it's, I don't know, it just doesn't balance out with how gimmicky it is. Next up is C tier, and still nothing has changed. I promise there were some changes later down the list, but still the main problem with the P2020, the RE45, is that they have too many conditions that need to be met for it to be about 80% of what you would get from SMG. You need hammer points, and your target has to have no armor to even come close to an SMG's output, and the RE45 is still not better than the car in that department, which has a higher DPS and higher damage per magazine. While the RE45 just barely has a higher DPS than the R99 and does about the same amount of damage per magazine, again, this is only when you have hammer points and they have no armor. I just fail to see the point in taking any of the light pistols over an SMG unless you have no choice to, or unless you're trying to get some clout on TikTok, I guess. The Mozam is much better than the other two pistols, and if I had a choice with all attachments, I'd take the Mozam first, then the P2020, then the RE45. But the Mozam suffers from the same problem as the other two pistols, in that you need attachments to really make it effective, and even then, why would you take it over any other shotgun or SMG, especially with the EVA 8 buffs? Something I would like to see them change in regards to the pistols is to slightly increase their damage per magazine. I think that would be a great way to bring them a bit more on par with the other guns without making them overpowered, because you're not really actually changing their damage output, you're just changing how long you have until you actually have to reload and how much damage per magazine that there actually is, making them a little bit more forgiving in fights. And of course, to round off our C tier, we have the triple take. The fact that you have to charge the shots to get something consistent going, combined with its very mid 78 rounds per minute compared to other marksman rifles on the list that fire much faster and a much more consistent output, just makes this gun a drag to pick up, let's be real. Maybe if they slightly reduced the charge time, it would give it a small buff to consistency without changing its burst potential, which was its problem previously. It was just too consistent. I think that might be a decent change, but it would depend on how much they actually reduce the charge as well. Next up for our B tier, we have the Hemlock. I said it once and I'll say it again. Why take a Hemlock when you could literally take any other AR in the game and perform better with it without even having to try? Burst weapons just do not sit well in Apex due to how prominent movement is in the game. Now, this may not matter as much at lower level lobbies, but in higher ranks, the Hemlock is anything but slept on. Full auto gives you a stream of consistency, while burst weapons often will leave you only hitting a few bullets out of your burst, then you are stuck waiting to hit your next burst while your target just runs around the corner, and all you're left with is a feeling of sadness deep inside your soul. Plus, you have to remember, these days, everyone and their mom is pretty much using the R301 or a Volt. Those guns are significantly easier to use than the Hemlock and also have a consistent output, so you might as well just use those. I think in order to make burst guns more viable of an option, then they would need to either make them easier to control at a distance or reduce its damage, but also reduce the time between each burst. Again, the issue with them is consistency, and I think this would be a great way to achieve that without affecting its actual damage output. Next up, we have the Sentinel. To me, this is one of the most fun guns in the game to use. Nothing feels better than getting kills with it in a close to mid-range, leaving players questioning their existence, but much like other guns previously listed, it just lacks consistency. This is due to its slower fire rate, which can lead to players getting away into cover with only a sliver of health. You basically need to hit headshots to get good value out of it. Otherwise, well, you're kind of out of luck. That plus guns like the 3030 and G7 as ground loot, there's just no point in picking up a Sentinel over those. You probably have noticed the common theme here. And of course, a similar thing can be said for the next weapon on our list, the longbow. As I said, with the 3030 and G7 on the ground now, it's hard to justify picking up either of these snipers. The faster fire rates, the increased mobility, versatility across ranges, and the fact that the G7 is literally the bane of all existence in mid to long ranges just makes me wonder why the longbow is even on the loot table. Even with the skull piercer, it is so lackluster, plus a majority of people are hitting mostly body shots in general anyway. It's clunky and unforgiving, so when it comes to the longbow, you have to work twice as hard for half the result compared to the marksman rifles, and that is why it still sits in B tier. An interesting change here would be if they increase the velocity of the longbow, and this would make it have a little bit less calculation required and easing up its use while having the trade-off of it having a clunky feeling. I don't think changing the damage numbers would help in general when it comes to buffs, because all that does is band-aid the problem, as I said earlier, or make things worse. Each gun has an identity that it should stick to, and each should have its trade-offs, so focusing the numbers on the trade-off seemed to be a more efficient way of going about things. The recent car SMG change is a great example of this. Even though I know a lot of you hate the changes made to the SMGs, I do think that what they did helped improve the diversity of the SMGs a lot, though I do miss barrel stabilizers, I won't lie. Next up, we have the Prowler. I have a hard time ranking this gun, I'm not gonna lie. Sometimes I want to put it in A tier, other times I just want to throw it against the wall. Generally, it's really easy to use, but man, when you miss that one burst that causes you the game, you can feel it. In general, I think the gun is good and it has good properties. However, I think making a similar change that we did with the Hemlock by reducing its damage per bullet and reducing time between bursts would help with consistency and how good it actually feels. In general, I'd say the Prowler is a significantly better spot than the Hemlock and generally pretty effective overall, particularly for controller players, but even for mouse and keyboard, it feels a lot better than it did before as well. But again, why take a Prowler when I could literally take any other SMG, at least as a mouse and keyboard player? And here is where I have to eat my words from the last tier list. The Alternator is back in B tier. It's a great gun, but it really does suffer due to not only its damage output, but its generally poor handling. The great thing about it is that it has a high damage per magazine, insanely easy hip fire, and it's easy to control. However, you could say the exact same thing for the Volt, which has a faster fire rate and a higher damage output. It's not as great at hipfire, but let's be honest, hipfire in general with any gun is relatively easy compared to other games. The other problem with the Alternator is that its handling sucks considering how poor its damage is. The tactical reload is slow compared to the Volt R99 and CAR, yet its damage is worse. I feel like this is one of the rare cases where a damage increase would help the Alternator significantly and wouldn't necessarily be a band-aid, but it would still need to be the lowest of the SMGs in my opinion. Something like 170 DPS instead of 160, and that will kind of put it between where it is now and the Volt. Another option that they could do is actually keep the DPS low, but give it extremely good handling properties. That would make the gun have a good identity without taking away from the other SMGs, and that would maybe be just enough to bring it up to A tier, though maybe that plus a small damage increase is necessary. This gun works great when you have really good movement, but that's again another variable where if you don't have that necessary movement to make it work, well, then you might as well be using another gun, if that makes any sense. Alright, next up we have the Turbocharged Devotion, and honestly nothing has changed with it, and it has a stupid high DPS. As I said before, with LMGs, they have high damage per magazine, usually with a low DPS, but the Devotion has the highest auto DPS in the game. It can be really strong against any gun while hip-firing, as it simply outdamages and outlasts them, even against SMGs in many cases. It also works well at mid-range, but where it starts to fall off is longer ranges due to its difficulty to control, and I think the Devotion right now is fine and really doesn't need much change, but that's just my opinion. And a similar thing can be said for the Spitfire. Right now, it's not a bad option, and it's still really effective due to its ability to just keep on firing for an eternity. I think they did a pretty good job with not nerfing it to the ground and keeping it relevant enough to be a gun that can be used until the endgame if you want. Still not better than the R301 though, obviously. Next up, we have the Cringe Rifle. Nothing has changed here, it is still cringe. I mean, do I really need to say more? I think a good change to make this gun less oppressive and annoying is if they made the fall off damage occur much sooner and make it something that is gradual. This makes it less effective at range while still keeping its same general properties of being a hit scan gun. Its hit scan properties make it extremely easy to use. There is no reason it should be so rewarding if you ask me. I guess we could kind of say a similar thing for the R301, couldn't we? Now, the Havoc is actually in a pretty good place right now, I'd say, but I just hate how some of the guns need attachments, especially when the attachments are difficult to find. I wish that they would add attachment levels, sort of like how they have the Wingman, where you can get a boosted loader or a skull piercer. Granted, they don't do the same things, but one is easier to find than the other, so it's likely that you'll be able to find at least one and get a good amount of value out of it. I think it would make guns that require attachments more relevant without breaking anything. The only problem is that they'd have to consider the loot pool, and that plays a big role on how the game plays out, so it's not as simple as just adding another hop-up. But other than that, the Havoc is clearly A tier. It is really good, and if you have the turbocharger, it's pretty much S tier. It does an insane amount of damage, it has an insanely high damage per magazine, and generally it's not too difficult to control. As long as you're not doing super far ranges, then you should be perfectly fine. And finally, to round off A tier, we have the R99. I know I placed it in S tier last time. However, after more time playing this season, it is quite clear that there are better options. With that said, I still think that the changes they made were actually really good for the R99 in particular, because it allowed it to have some breathing room and not be suffocated by the car SMG. I still would like to see a slight damage per mag increase for the R99, just a hair, but I think overall it's in a pretty decent spot at the moment. Alright, now the moment you've been waiting for, our S tier. And here's another place where I may have gotten a little overzealous with our last tier list. I think it's safe to say now that the Flatline is still easily S tier. While Tipfire was nerfed, it was actually very slight, and the Flatline still serves as an extremely versatile gun at all ranges with a really high damage per magazine, and that alone can make it extremely strong. Not to mention, it's pretty easy to use, all things considered. It's basically just a longer range Volt that's a little bit more difficult to control, but with the benefit of having a much higher damage per magazine, which may not sound like much, but as I always say, damage per magazine does make a huge difference, especially in the larger capacities. Alright, here's another one that I probably jumped the gun on last time, and that's the car SMG. Fact of the matter is, it has obviously the best DPS out of all the SMGs, and on top of that, it's really versatile in regards to it being the only gun that you can actually change between light and heavy ammo, so that can really help with economy for you and your teammates. Not only that, but even with the nerfs, it's still relatively easy to control as long as you're using recoil smoothing, so basically strafing while you shoot, but the main downside of it is just that it's not as versatile in regards to how effective it is at different ranges with different types of aim. So its hipfire was nerfed, its long range was nerfed, but its DPS is absolutely insane, and overall it is a gun that is still something that you can control with enough practice. And once you are able to use it effectively, it's kind of hard to justify using something like an R99 or a Prowler or an Alternator, because the damage output is just so good. It's really hard to not put this in anything lower than S tier. Next, we've got the Peacekeeper and EVA 8. When it comes to the EVA 8 versus the Peacekeeper, I think it will largely come down to preference. However, the Peacekeeper has a higher one-shot burst potential on cracked targets, so if you have good aim, this is a very rewarding shotgun to use. But for consistency, it's hard to say that the Peacekeeper will outperform the EVA unless it's at range where the EVA 8 very quickly falls off. Even without the hop-up, the EVA 8 has a lot of room for error with a high damage output. With a hop-up, it becomes very similar to the Peacekeeper, except if you miss one of the shots while aiming, there is a chance that you will hit the second one. The great thing about the EVA is that you can switch between the double tap mode, meaning you can have both the more consistent damage mode and the higher burst potential whenever you want. But again, this really does come down to preference and playstyle. Personally, I'm taking the PK, but that's just me. And of course, you knew this one was coming, and that's the G7. This gun is crazy strong right now and can be really annoying to go against. It feels really good as a whole, so I think here's a situation where nerfing the damage is not necessarily a band-aid, as the damage is its problem. It's just a little smidgen too much, and I think most would agree. Of course, I don't want to see it nerfed into the ground because it does have its downsides, as any gun does, but inherently its damage per bullet is clearly too much. I don't like the idea of nerfing its fire rate because that has a direct feeling to how it actually feels to fire in a negative way, but the other option would be to reduce its damage per magazine, because it does have a pretty giant mag, all things considered. Alright, next up, we have the Wingman. They did an amazing job tuning the Wingman, in my opinion. It is a bit weird that it's a sniper now, but other than that, I think it's still great. You have to be more cautious about your ammo now, and you can't just take one stack of heavy, then stack tons of heals or grenades. It helps to keep the sniper attachments and ammo circulating rather than just sitting alone and depressed in the open bin, which in turn helps the other snipers when you think about it, making getting those attachments and ammo a little bit easier, a lot easier, because everyone likes the Wingman. The thing I was worried about was that I thought I would never find an extended mag for the wingman, but I honestly have zero problems ever finding them. Plus on top of that, it still has the boosted loader and skull piercer as options, and I just really do think they did an amazing job with this change for sure, as it helps the game in more ways than just changing the wingman for the sake of changing it. It's helping the total economy, and that may not seem like it does anything, but it makes a huge difference on how the game plays. Next up, we have the Volt. Now, personally, I'd put this at the top of S tier. However, the R301 is simply too good for how easy it is to use, but the Volt is still insanely strong. It is literally if you took the Flatline and the R301 and then made them have a baby and turned it into an SMG, and this gun is a favorite among many for good reason. The main downside of it is that it's not quite as easy to use as the R301 at range, as it has a little bit more of a bouncy recoil as well as a slightly slower fire rate, so it just becomes less forgiving than the R301. And yes, I know there is recoil smoothing, but that only does so much and becomes less effective the further the range, so you do need to keep that in mind. Where with the R301, it doesn't matter what range at all really, and its hipfire is pretty close to the Volt as well, so even in that department it can keep up. Overall, easy S tier gun when it comes to the Volt. But finally, and last on our list, we have the R301. It still has a higher DPS than the Volt, it is way too easy to use, and it is extremely accurate. That's the R301, and it's just the way it's always going to be. It still handles all ranges extremely well, all things considered, and it has no other explanation in regards to feeling except for butter. So, do you agree with this tier list? What would you change? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.